Thank you. Okay, let's get started. And we're going to a totally different tone from the last session. My name is Liaqat Ahmed. I'm the chair of the board at Sun Valley, and it's my great privilege to introduce our next two guests. So with the brutal Middle East war going into its 9th month, the Russian invasion of Ukraine in its 3rd year, and the Cold War between the US and China showing no signs of thawing, the US is having to deal with a series of geopolitical challenges which it hasn't confronted since the 1970s. The statesman most responsible for piloting the US through that era was Henry Kissinger. Now, Henry Kissinger died last year at the age of 100, so he's not around to answer the question, what should we do? There is, however, no better person than our next guest, Niall Ferguson. One of the most interesting and prolific big thinkers around. He has written some 20 books on international history and economics, and he is midway through a magisterial biography of Henry Kissinger, part 1 of which came out in 2015, and he's currently writing part 2. There is another reason why Niall is actually the perfect person to help us answer such a speculative question. 25 years ago, he edited a book called Virtual History, Alternatives and Counterfactuals, in which he asked a group of historians to imagine alternative outcomes to past events. For example, what would the history of the 1960s be if President Kennedy had not been shot? Or the early 20th century, if Britain had not entered the First World War on the side of France and Russia against Germany. With that book, Niall not only helped create a whole field of what has come to be known as counterfactual history, a way of looking at the contingencies of that stresses the contingencies of events and reminds us that nothing is predetermined, that ultimately all that happens depends on the actions and decisions of individuals. He also displayed a wonderful talent for allowing his imagination to roam and speculate what could have happened, what it could have been. So in that vein, we asked him to tap into his talent for inventiveness and speculation about the current world situation confronting the US, and ask, what would Kissinger do if he was still alive in a position of power? Niall will be in conversation with EVAN OSNOS, journalist extraordinaire, Pulitzer Prize-winning political reporter, a China expert, a presidential biographer, and truly a great friend to this conference. So it's my privilege to invite Niall and Evan onto the stage.
Thank you, my friend. Well, good afternoon, folks, and welcome back. After what has been just an incredibly stimulating couple of days already, and it's only the middle of the afternoon here today. The very special guest who is sitting beside me here was described in the Times of London not too long ago as the most brilliant British historian of his generation. But I have to tell you that's not quite right, because he is in fact British and American, having gained dual nationality in 2018. A brave soul, I would say.
Very proud to be an American.
And in fact, it is, by the way, a sign of Britain's jealous determination to hold on to him that even after he became one of us, he was knighted earlier this year for his literary contributions. So here.
I'm not using Sir Neil in the land of the free, just FYI.
So Sir Neil was approached about 2 decades ago.
No, don't do that.
It's
Don't do that, Sir Evan.
you never know. We could end up back in British clutches. I want to get on good paper here. Just sounds prudent.
You never know.
We're gonna talk.
You'll be back.
Well, I remember. I've done the reading.
My favorite song in Hamilton, I must confess.
If you sing it at the knighthood ceremony, how would that go over? Pretty well.
I think it'll go down quite well, but I'll wait until after it's been done.
So, Neil, we are going to talk about the full spectrum of our present puzzles in the world, both abroad and here at home. But before we do, it occurs to me that I think we have to do a little bit of definition of the terms, because I looked it up today, and the median age of the average American is 38.5 years old, meaning that person was born a decade after Henry Kissinger left government service in 1977. So I think for some people, I mean, some of us here might be 39 or above, but for some people, I think Kissinger is a bit like the sort of Elvis Presley of geopolitics. They sort of have an abstract sense of him, but they may not really grasp the particulars of why it is that we still refer to him now, why we look to that life, that extraordinary life, for meaning. So if you can give us a sense of Heinz Kissinger to 100-year-old Kissinger in Beijing, in 2 minutes or less.
Heinz Kissinger, who became Henry Kissinger, was, I think, the most consequential thinker and actor in the realm of statecraft or foreign policy that the United States has produced. And I think one sign of his importance is how much controversy there has been about him. Somewhat appropriate that thunderclouds are gathering as I say all this. Because here was a man who lived 100 years, which not many of us do, so that his most important acts as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State lay half a century back. I was just a kid when Henry Kissinger was in the White House and then at the State Department. And part of what happened after he left office, after Gerald Ford lost to Jimmy Carter, is that a great battle over his reputation was waged between journalists on the left, who, led by people like Seymour Hersh and Christopher Hitchens, were determined to portray Henry Kissinger as not just a bad Secretary of State, but a war criminal. And on the other side, Henry Kissinger. And his defenders, but mainly Henry Kissinger, who fought back very tenaciously against the criticisms. And one of the points I'll make in the second volume of the biography is that in many ways he fought back so hard that he inadvertently validated these quite journalistic attacks. It was actually a tremendously bad strategy to answer every criticism and rebut every article against him. There are probably people sitting here whose minds generate war criminal when they hear the name Henry Kissinger, because there's been such a successful campaign to make that association. But what are the points that I make in this biography, one volume of which has already come out? That was the volume subtitled The Idealist, which came out 9 years ago, is that if you think of the things that Kissinger's accused of by his critics, supporting authoritarian regimes or authorizing bombing campaigns that killed civilians, it is actually pretty hard to think of a Secretary of State who didn't do those things at some point in their career beginning in 1945. So my position is either they're all war criminals, or it seems invidious to single out Henry Kissinger and say that he's one for doing things that pretty much every administration, including Barack Obama's administration, did, because Obama's administration certainly supported authoritarian regimes and certainly bombed civilians. So I think it's important to write a biography like this without the kind of journalistic impulses that motivated Hirsch and Hitchens, but rather to approach it as an historian and to say, how do we understand this figure who played such a dominant role in American foreign policy, especially in the 1970s, continued to be influential right to the very last year of his life? How can we assess that? And more importantly, what can we learn from his extraordinary life, which began as a German Jew in 1923, which turned him into a refugee as a teenager? What can we learn from his life that might help us better understand our situation? So that's been my motivation for writing this book.
You have the first volume of the book, which the subtitle of which is The Idealist. Right there on the front cover is a provocative. It's a provocation of a kind. People would say he's the icon of realpolitik of the Cold War. How could you define him as an idealist? What's your answer to that?
Well, volume one is the history really of an intellectual, because almost all of Kissinger's career in government comes after 1968, where that book ends. And I wanted to take him seriously, not only as a thinker, but also to take his early life seriously. I mean, it's a pretty incredible story that a German Jewish refugee who is drafted and sent back to Germany as a GI ends up as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. That in itself is an amazing story.
And finds 12 people with the name Kissinger who died in the Holocaust.
Discovers that at least a dozen members of his family, including one of his grandmothers, were victims of the Holocaust. I mean, however you feel about Kissinger today, I defy you to be unmoved by the essay that he wrote after witnessing the liberation of a concentration camp outside Hanover with the title The Eternal Jew. And it's an extraordinary essay. I reproduced it in full in volume one because it makes you understand the extraordinarily traumatic circumstances from which he emerged. And one has to kind of feel some sympathy with a young man who leaves Germany in 1938 as a refugee and is back there in 1944, experiencing the Battle of the Bulge as a rifleman and then witnessing the liberation of a concentration camp, going back to Fürth, where he'd grown up, and finding that pretty much every member of his family who had stayed was dead. That's hard to ignore, it seems to me, if one's trying to write a biography. And it also makes it a little implausible, just from first principles, that such a man would be indifferent to the plight of vulnerable minorities, and such a man would be completely callous in his attitude towards dictatorships. It seems, if you think about it, a little implausible as a hypothesis.
But as you say, at one point you write about, I think, what you described as the sins of omission or commission when it comes to Cambodia, Bangladesh, East Timor. So in a sense, you have to situate the moral insult of the Holocaust within what? Within a sense that he believed that national strategy, national priority, a sort of cold-hearted, cold-blooded reason had to prevail?
No, I don't think that's right, actually, because part of the points in Volume 1 is that he's actually an idealist, literally, influenced by the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, not a realist. He's critical in his early writings of Metternich and Bismarck. He began but never completed a biography of Bismarck that would have been highly critical. We know that because quite a lot of it survives. And as I try and show in Volume 1, it's completely wrong to call him the arch realist or a Machiavellian. He had absolutely no time for Machiavelli's thought. He's far more influenced by the German idealists. And he argues that the ultimate goal of policy must be peace, the avoidance of world war. And the argument that Kissinger makes, even before he enters the corridors of power, is that the imperative must be to avoid a global conflict as catastrophic as World War I and World War II. And he thought deeply about why those wars had happened, observed that they were quite different in the sense that World War I was the result of miscalculation by statesmen and generals. But World War II was the result of the erroneous policy of appeasement, which acted as though Hitler was a rational actor rather than a murderous megalomaniac. And Kissinger writes in a brilliant essay on the problem of conjecture, the conjecture was that if one simply played for time, Hitler would not literally attempt to wipe out the Jews and conquer all of Europe. But it turned out that he did intend to do those things, and by playing for time in 1938, the British and French leaders very nearly allowed him to succeed. So I think a starting point for understanding his career in government is that Kissinger felt the ultimate objective must be to avoid World War III, especially as World War III would be waged with nuclear weapons. And it's not accidental that he first becomes a public figure, a public intellectual, when he publishes a book in 1957 entitled Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy. So I think you've got to start from the position that his ultimate goal is to avoid that Third World War, because he'd seen World War up close in a way that nobody sitting here has, and that everything else ultimately had to be subordinated to that grand strategic objective. And this is the most important point that people struggle with. If you're trying to avoid World War III, your number one objective is to make sure that the US-Soviet relationship does not produce another Cuban Missile Crisis, which in 1962 had very nearly brought about World War III. That's your priority. And everything else has to kind of come second, third, fourth, or fifth in its importance relative to that top priority. Now that means that periodically you will make choices between evils. And this is the other difficult thing people grapple with. Most choices in the realm of foreign policy are not between motherhood and apple pie or a war crime. That is not how it works. Most choices are between bad and worse. And your calculation, if you think of it as an idealist, is in order, with respect to avoiding World War III, to get the less bad outcome, what should I do? But that, of course, leads to bad outcomes. Bad things will happen because there are no good options in certain situations. And I could give you multiple examples, but just to throw out one, in the grand strategy that Kissinger and Richard Nixon evolved, which was to exploit the splits between China and the Soviet Union to the advantage of the United States, it was critical, vital, to establish a channel of communication to Beijing, which at that point, at the beginning of the Nixon administration, in January 1969, was completely cut off. There was almost no communication with the People's Republic of China. They pursued that opening with extraordinary care and secretiveness, and they were prepared to sacrifice other things to that end, including, and I'll be completely blunt about it, the fate of the people of East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh. Because the channel to China that worked, and they tried many, was through Pakistan. So that's a good example of how you can accuse Henry Kissinger of a bad thing. Callousness in the face of the near-genocidal policies that the Pakistani government pursued against what became Bangladesh. It wasn't as if he was oblivious to the sufferings of the people of Bangladesh. But the priority in his mind was getting to Beijing and having that conversation with Mao and Zhou Enlai that completely changed the geopolitics of the 1970s. That's what people like Christopher Hitchens Hans Seymour Hersh never wanted to acknowledge that there was a grand strategy, and in pursuit of that strategy, there were going to be some bad things that would happen along the way.
So in a sense, as you say, he was not unaware. I mean, the Blood Telegram, I remember, by Gary Bass, was a very eloquent description of what they did know at the time. And as you say, the goal, the dominant goal, the overriding goal was to prevent a Cold War from becoming a hot war, which in its own uncanny and unsettling way brings us very much up to the present. Because here we are at a moment, and there are a range of ways in which the present moment is resonant with that period. But here we are at a moment where we are contending with let's face it, a new Cold War with China, trying to figure out how to prevent it from becoming a new hot war. How much do you think the toolbox of what became known as détente is useful today? How much can we apply what Kissinger did with the Soviets to what we might want to do and not do with the Chinese?
Well, Evan, I think it's enormously relevant. I've been arguing for, 5 years now, that we're in a new Cold War, in a second Cold War, only this time it's with the People's Republic of China rather than the Soviet Union. And the first time I hazarded this hypothesis with Kissinger was in Beijing. And we were sitting there together at a Bloomberg conference, and I plucked up the courage to say, do you think we're in a new Cold War? And my reason for doing it was that if anybody could recognize a new Cold War, it had to be somebody who had lived through the entirety of the first Cold War and been a major actor. And I actually didn't expect him to say yes. But he replied very memorably, and I won't try and do his extraordinary voice.
Oh, you have to. You really...
Well, he replied, I'll see if I can do it. We are...
That's pretty good.
...in the foothills of a Cold War. And...
Did you have to perform that, by the way, when you were given the job of biographer? Was that one of the...
I've spent so much time with him. I mean, this project dates back 20 years. And in those 20 years, I've spent a great deal of time with Henry Kissinger trying to understand him and learning a lot in the process. And I guess I picked up a relatively good impersonation along the way. But it does sound better in his voice. The foothills of a Cold War is a fantastic phrase. And it captured, I think, rightly where we were at that point. And the following year, somebody else asked him the question, and he said, we're now in the mountain passes of a Cold War. And I came back to it just a bit before his 100th birthday and asked for an update. And he gave a very surprising answer then. He said, and this was, I think, late 2022, the second Cold War will be more dangerous than the first. And by that he meant that new technologies, in addition to nuclear weapons, particularly artificial intelligence, about which he became obsessed in his final years, would make this a more dangerous Cold War. So, I think we are in Cold War II. It's not identical any more than World War II was identical to World War I, but it's enough like it for this to be a useful nomenclature. There are two superpowers. The others are also RANs in the domain of artificial intelligence. It's the US and China, and nobody else is really relevant. Same is true of quantum computing. And in this second Cold War, we confront many of the same challenges that Kissinger's generation confronted in the first. There's an ideological dimension to it, which has become more obvious with Xi Jinping as China's leader, and I think that's a point that people still underestimate in the US and in Europe. It has an economic dimension to it. It's a technological race. It's an arms race because China's furiously building a nuclear arsenal as well as a vast navy. And it has the same flashpoint, which was Taiwan in the 1970s and is Taiwan again today. One of the things that really struck me, and you'll appreciate this as a China expert, was sitting down and reading through the original documents of the first meeting between Kissinger and Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, when he'd gone secretly from Pakistan in 1971, completely unknown to anybody, including the Secretary of State, to meet with Joe
He
and
thought
I.
it was need-to-know basis only at that.
And it wouldn't have worked, by the way. People sometimes complain about secrecy as if it's a sort of wicked thing.
Well, particularly the Secretary of State did. He was not pleased about that.
But you would never have stopped it leaking if it
Yeah.
had got across the state. So he gets there, and they sit down, and they have these extraordinary long meetings, which are beautifully documented on the US side by Winlord and others. And the topic of conversation that Joe and I keeps coming back to is Taiwan. And so, in a sense, we are not that far away from the world of the early 1970s. Half a century has passed, but the issues are the same. Taiwan, the Russians invading their neighbors on the western side. It was Czechoslovakia in 68, it's Ukraine in our time. The Middle East has fundamentally the same problem. There's even a surprise attack almost on the exact 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur attack in 1973. So part of what has motivated me to write this book, which, by the way, is by far the hardest book I've ever written.
Volume 2 is.
Much the hardest book I've ever written because of the sheer volume of material, has been the sense that we are toggling back and forth between our time and the 1970s. And we don't quite realize how similar these periods are, and therefore I don't think we realize how much we can learn from that time. And you mentioned détente. Can I quickly say something about
By all means. I think that is one area in which it does feel as if there is something from the toolbox that even if one feels about Henry Kissinger, there's a lot we don't want to replicate, that maybe there's something in there of value.
Détente, which is a French word just meaning improving a relationship. It's quite different from friendship. It just means improving a relationship. Was a term that was used frequently, and not just by Kissinger, to describe the attempt to improve the relationship between Washington and Moscow. And it got a very bad reputation, that word, because of Ronald Reagan. Right. Because Ronald Reagan ran against détente. We forget this, but when he was bidding to become a national figure, going from governor of California to challenging Gerald Ford for the nomination, and ultimately getting the nomination, it's amazing how much of his campaign for national recognition was a critique of Henry Kissinger. Although they had a relatively friendly personal relationship, Reagan loved to hammer détente, arguing that it amounted to selling out, to appeasing the Soviet Union, to losing the Cold War as a strategy. Now, this worked well for Reagan, but it was a complete misrepresentation of what Kissinger and Nixon had tried to do, which was to try to avoid having another Cuban Missile Crisis, despite the fact that the Soviets never stopped trying it on wherever they could, including in Cuba, but to try and entangle the Soviets in so many different negotiations on arms control, on European conventional forces, on space exploration. You just entangled them in so many different negotiations, on economic issues, on technology transfer, that the relationship inevitably became less confrontational. There was no naivety on Kissinger's part about what the Soviets represented. In a sense, he was a true Cold Warrior in that he regarded the totalitarian regime as a profoundly dangerous thing, not significantly less dangerous than Hitler's Third Reich. But the goal of détente was to try to avoid it escalating into a hot war. And my argument would be, and I published a piece about this in Foreign Affairs not so long ago, that we need to do détente again. We can't risk a hot war with China over Taiwan today. It would actually be an incredibly dangerous thing for the United States and indeed for the world. And so it's much better to be engaged in negotiations with China than brinkmanship of the sort that periodically there has been in recent years.
We're going to move on in a second, but on this point, there's a very interesting debate to come, which you know well about, which is that at the very moment that you've argued for détente, there are, in fact, colleagues at the Hoover Institution who Matt Pottinger, Mike Gallup. Well, there we are. Kissinger has joined the chat.
Can anybody translate from thunderclaps?
By the way, is it writing about, since he's listening, writing about Henry Kissinger And we'll get to Daytona.
I do feel as if he is, actually. It's
But
it's quite unnerving, that feeling.
He was, as we all know, he was 100 when he passed away last year. He was not inclined to leave this mortal coil. He believed that he might outlive you.
No, I feared that I might not survive. My nightmare was that he would give the address at my memorial service. But it was an extraordinary thing to see a man whose health was failing continue to engage passionately on issues as apparently unconnected as artificial intelligence and US-China relations. After his multiple 100th birthday parties, I think there were at least 6, he went to Beijing and met with Xi Jinping to discuss the issue of artificial intelligence arms control. And this was a very important concern of his in the final months of his life. And in fact, in a sense, he hasn't entirely left us, because there's a book that has yet to be published that he co-authored with Eric Schmidt and Craig Mundy on AI that will come out, I think, later this year. And that book is full of, you can tell the parts that Henry wrote, it's full of foreboding about what AI may do to geopolitics. And I must say it impressed me that he was willing, although his physical health was failing, but he was mentally still entirely engaged. He was willing to make that trip to Beijing, which could easily have killed him, in the belief that we were dangerously close to repeating the mistakes of 1962. He was fearful of a Taiwan semiconductor crisis, by analogy with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he felt, not unreasonably, I think, that American politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, were moving to a reckless policy of confrontation. I'll give you an illustration of this. Richard Haas, my old friend, long-time Grand Panjandrum of the Council on Foreign Relations, in 2020 wrote a piece saying, surely strategic ambiguity over Taiwan is obsolete.
Antique. Yeah.
But actually, strategic ambiguity had kept the peace on this issue for about half a century. And Kissinger's position was, we should not move away from that, because if we risk supporting Taiwanese independence, that is a Chinese red line, and we could find ourselves in a version of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but with the roles reversed, with China blockading the island off its shores, and the US having to send a naval expedition, which, if you think about it, is the exact mirror image of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because in the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was the US that blockaded Cuba, and it was Khrushchev who had to send the Naval Expeditionary Force. So I think he felt passionately until the last day of his life that we had not fully learnt the lessons of Cold War I, and we risked stumbling into World War III.
We need to move beyond Asia for a second to the Middle East, because, of course, it was the other great terrain of his diplomatic life. And you know, he was involved in negotiations, Israel, Egypt, Arab allies, to bring about the end of the 73 war, open the pathway to peace in 78, Camp David Accords. If he was contending with what we're looking at right now in the Middle East to live up to our mandate, what would Kissinger do?
One of the final conversations that we had was about that. He felt that a fundamental mistake had been made back in 1970. And that mistake was to treat the Palestine Liberation Organization as the recognized representative of the Palestinian people, as opposed to regarding the Palestinians as a Jordanian problem or a problem of the existing Arab states. And I think if you look back over 50 years, you can see the extreme difficulty of arriving at a solution to the Palestinian problem that implied statehood. I don't think we shall see a Palestinian state in our lifetimes, because I think the opportunity was there in the time of Bill Clinton and was blown up in the intifadas and blown up with the rise of Hamas. So I think as he looked back, he regarded that as a fundamental strategic error of policy. And I find myself looking through the documents and realizing how contingent that decision was. It was not one that he felt strongly about. And indeed, in the meetings that were held about that subject, he often played devil's advocate. And in many ways, his devil's advocate questions about dealing with the PLO were right. So that's one important point. It's hard for me to see now how you get to a two-state solution, even though that has become almost the standard assumption of policymakers, so much so that European states now recognize a non-existent Palestinian state as if that achieves anything. So I think his most brilliant achievement was peace between Egypt and Israel. It was a much harder thing to do than the opening to China, because you started from a position of outright war. And if you read Volume 2, which I've written about half of, one of the most impressive aspects is the extraordinary way he nudges each side closer to the point at which there's first an armistice and then a negotiation, and it is a fantastic performance.
Talk about that gamesmanship, because, and I don't, maybe, am I giving away a secret? If
No,
I
I've said this in public before.
So the subtitle of Volume 2 is The Player. And why is it called The Player? What game precisely was he playing when he was doing the work of statesmanship?
I didn't want to call it The Realist. Volume 1 is The Idealist. It would have been too obvious to call Volume 2 The Realist, and I also don't think it would be right. It hits me as I worked my way through the material how often chess came up. And chess is the way both the Soviets and some Americans thought about the Cold War. It was, of course,
he actually played.
He was an extremely serious chess player as a young man, made light of his ability when he was in office. But it's actually, if you're interested, anybody, put up your hands if you play chess. Okay, chess players, you will like the fact.
This is shameless pandering to the chess caucus, but I'll let it go. We'll let it go.
I have a son who's a total chess nerd, so I'm kind of back into chess. So Kissinger is the man who phones up Bobby Fischer and says, "This is the worst player in the world. Call him the best player," which is a great opening, persuading Fischer to take the famous match in Iceland with Spassky, which becomes a kind of metaphor for the whole Cold War. And it hit me as I was reading the documents around that extraordinary event that chess crops up again and again as a metaphor in all the documents. And they recurrently talk about relations with the Soviets as a chess game, and the world is this chessboard. And I thought, you know what, that is actually a good way of understanding the Cold War, because there are two players, and many other countries are merely pieces on the board. That's why that is a good and helpful metaphor. But there's this other game that goes on, which is the game played in Washington by the professional politicians, and that is poker. American politicians are not chess players, they're poker players. And in fact, they all played poker. Truman was a great poker player. They all played poker. And they think like poker players. And one of the points I want to make in the book is that Henry Kissinger was much better at chess than at poker. He was extremely effective in the great chess game. But when it was Washington poker, it's actually clear that he was much less skilled and frequently outmaneuvered from J. Edgar Hoover to Don Rumsfeld. There were other poker players much better than him. And so the book toggles back and forth between the chess game and this altogether different game that is being played in the White House. And you can't really separate them. I mean, when he's on the phone to Nixon, of course they talk about the domestic political benefits of the opening to China. I knew he wouldn't like this part.
Objection, Your Honor.
He did not like the subtitle "The Player." But
we're going to get electrocuted because of this.
I'm really getting in. I mean, if we're struck by lightning, can you imagine what on earth will the New York Times say?
It would be a hell of a story. Be an amazing story.
Henry Kissinger not in hell, official. So I think that if you use that image of games, you understand well just how that world worked and still works. We're in the midst of a fantastically complex poker game right now.
To that point, I mean, look, it's fascinating
that
how
is
much...
what's going on this weekend.
It's
Massive, high-stakes poker. And I think Obama has most of the cards at this point. But that's a totally different game from chess. We're playing chess with Xi Jinping, and Ukraine is one part of the chessboard, and Taiwan is another, and the Middle East is another. That game of chess is entirely familiar. It's there in Kissinger's writings, and one can see why détente is a way of avoiding losing the game, i.e. causing World War III. But the poker game's a whole other game.
To this question, and we'll go to questions in a few minutes, but just to this point, and this gets to the gamesmanship, was he fundamentally a catastrophist, was he a pessimist, or was he an optimist?
So that was something that was held against him by his foes in Washington. Admiral Zumwalt was one of those who went public saying he thinks America's doomed, he's a Spenglerian, he thinks it's Weimar America, and that's why he has no conviction that we can prevail in the Cold War. And I don't think that's right. I think that's part of the Reagan anti-détente narrative. As I said at the beginning, the idealist's vision is of Kantian perpetual peace. How do you get there in a fallen world? And what's interesting about Kissinger's rhetoric, the way he talks about world order, is that it changes after Nixon leaves. Nixon really didn't like ideas of interdependence. He didn't like that part of Kissinger's thought that emphasized creating global structures that would reduce the risk of conflict. Once Nixon's gone over Watergate, Kissinger can talk more openly about his global vision. And this idea that we're moving from an age of a bipolar world to one of interdependence is a key Kissinger idea. And I think you can see in the later parts of the book, which cover much less well-known stuff, people write much less about Gerald Ford's presidency than Richard Nixon's, for some reason, who knows why. But actually the Ford stuff is super interesting. Without Nixon constraining him, for example, Kissinger goes to great lengths and devotes a great deal of energy to the end of white minority rule in southern Africa, which he pursues as an objective, explaining to the Rhodesians and to Namibia and to South Africa that this is not a sustainable way to run southern Africa. That's part of the, I'll say, idealist vision that Kissinger had, which was quite different from Nixon's idea where national interest, America first, was really the guiding principle. So I think part of what's important about the book is to bring that period back into vision. It's almost never talked about because it doesn't fit the narrative. If you're trying to portray Henry Kissinger as a uniquely evil person, it's slightly awkward for the narrative if he's the guy who explains to the white South Africans that their regime is not going to last.
Considering how much of his life he spent grappling with the idea of the Soviet mission and of Russian identity, how do you think he thought about Putin's project toward the end of his life?
Well, he had many meetings with Putin dating back to Putin's early days as a minor figure in St. Petersburg, and I think had a good understanding of Putin as Homo Sovieticus, a product of the KGB. I think some of the most interesting writing that he did relates to how one deals with post-Soviet Russia. And he certainly saw the trouble coming in Ukraine. You can see that in the way he writes in World Order about Russia. In 2014, he wrote a brilliant essay for the Wall Street Journal pointing out that if the West offered NATO membership to Ukraine but never delivered it, it would create a fundamentally unstable situation. That was spot on. And not enough people paid attention to that essay. And in the final years of his life, he grappled a lot with the problem of what to do with Russia, with the Russia-Ukraine war, changing his position in a very unexpected way.
That's what I think is interesting. He was, in some ways, it feels as if this kind of great certainty that he'd had at various points was colliding with the reality of the depth of Putin's aggression.
Kissinger was never dogmatic in the way that he might have been if he'd stayed an academic. Constant contact with the real world forces adjustment of your assessment. That's something that's very clear from Volume 2. And at one point he surprised me in late 2022 by saying, and he went on to say it publicly, Ukraine has, through its military efforts, established its right to be an independent nation state and potentially one of the great powers of Europe. That Ukrainians were flabbergasted because at the beginning of the war, he'd sounded as if he was ready to cut a deal with Putin. By the later part of the period that we're talking about, he'd moved his position. And I think that illustrates the reality of statesmanship, of doing diplomacy or whatever you want to call it, international relations. It's not applying some template that you figured out at Harvard to whatever the problem set that you confront might be. You've got to be adjusting your strategy according to circumstances. And I think the Ukraine case illustrates that well. So
before we open it up to you all, just one other question in the vein of what would Kissinger do, which is, after all, here is a man who was flying to China at the age of 100. Would he have advised President Biden to step aside in this race? No longer a counterfactual.
Well, it was not easy for a man of 100 to complain about Biden's age. And I don't think I ever heard him make that argument. But it's interesting that almost every president, after he left office, consulted him. Almost everyone. But I don't think Joe Biden did. I mean, you'll remember that Hillary Clinton was booed and hissed for first reviewing one of his books positively and then paying tribute to him. This gave Bernie Sanders a great opening. Obama consulted him, although Kissinger once said to me, he only calls to ask me for favors, never for advice. But every president took Kissinger into their confidence because he had this extraordinary network. He was connected, despite no longer holding office, to all the world leaders and continued to be a player, I use the word advisedly, throughout his life, long after he'd left office. His relationship with Biden was never close, and I don't think Biden ever consulted him.
You know, the irony is, early in his career, before he became drawn into the Judiciary Committee, he actually wanted to be Henry Kissinger. He reflected on the fact that's what he wanted to be regarded as a great statesman. And in some ways, he was always dogged by the fact that he was pulled back into domestic politics.
You are his biographer.
Well,
I am not.
Here we are. John Burnham Schwartz is going to help us gather questions from the audience.
Thanks, guys. There's one right up here in the middle section.
Hi, thank you so much. So you speak a lot about the value that Kissinger saw in building and maintaining relationships. Can you talk a little bit about how your relationship with him started and how it evolved over the 20 years that you were working with him?
Absolutely. And I tried to make that very clear in the introduction to Volume 1. We met, I mean, it's nearly 20 years ago now, in London, and had a conversation about a book I had written about World War I. And then Elle Macpherson walked into the room and he kind of disapparated in mid-sentence and reappeared next to her. And
he really was an idealist in that sense.
He was certainly, he idealized many things and beautiful women among them. And then we corresponded about the possibility of there being a scholarly biography, and I know I was not the first person he discussed the idea with. I think he felt that his 3 volumes of memoirs could never really be an effective response to the critics because they were by him. And what he craved, and I think with some reason, was a scholarly account of what he'd done as opposed to a journalistic one. And it's true to say that the version of Henry Kissinger that emerged in the late 70s and 80s has been remarkably persistent without any real revision. So I think his motive was somebody needs to write a scholarly account because that hasn't been done. And maybe this abrasive Scottish historian will be able to do it. And at first I said no, because I knew that it would be an incredibly difficult task, and I probably wouldn't change anybody's mind, whatever I wrote. So I said no, and he replied, I'm very disappointed because I've just found 50 boxes of my private papers that I thought had been lost.
That's what's known in the intelligence business as a dangle.
And
I
as the dangle appeared, Ferguson the trout bit on the hook. I said, well, let me come and have a look. And as soon as I started to go through this stuff, including that essay, The Eternal Jew, and the letters he'd written to his parents from the front line in World War II, I knew I had to write the book, because the minute I read those documents, I thought, the Henry Kissinger of the New York Review of Books is not the real Henry Kissinger. There is a different story to be told here. And I had worked on Jewish history before. I'm not Jewish myself. I'd written the history of the Rothschilds. I'd done a biography of Sigmund Warburg. My early work was about Germany and the great German catastrophe that produced the Holocaust. And so it was very natural to me, if I was going to write an American book, that it would be about him. Because I thought I had an advantage in writing about somebody who came from that now lost world of German Jews. So I knew that it would be an extremely difficult relationship because of his reputation. And so I was quite deliberate in doing a lot of our interaction by correspondence rather than by telephone, because Henry was a master of the telephone. And I'm not. I hate the telephone. So for a long time we corresponded or met, but rarely spoke until he discovered Zoom.
And tired you out a bit on Zoom.
And Zoom, and, I couldn't resist Zoom. So the relationship, it would be untrue to say that I did not become close to him. How could one not? I was delving into parts of his life he'd entirely forgotten. And at times I thought, am I becoming Boswell to his Johnson? But no, I think it's a unique privilege for a biographer to be able to work with the subject. It gives you an advantage that you simply cannot have if all you have are the documents. And I think I hope you'll find when you read Volume 2, that I retained the all-important scholarly detachment. For me, that's my default setting. No matter how I feel about a subject, and I said this to him, I will only write this if you're ready for me to write what I find. And you won't like it all. And he did not like it all. He didn't speak to me for about a month after he saw the manuscript of Volume 1. So it was an extraordinary and very, very complicated diplomatic relationship. Not quite a chess game.
Great answer. Other questions? Down here in the front row, Cash.
Thanks so much for a great talk. So when you mention Reagan kind of rising through the presidency, through kind of like hating on Kissinger in a way, what my mind conjures up is this idea of anti-establishment and establishment. And I can't help but think of the presidency of Donald Trump and Joe Biden as representing this again, as we have Donald Trump who's very isolationist, I consider very anti-establishment. So I guess, in your opinion, what do you think, or what would Kissinger think, of the future of the United States in this paradigm? Like, are we leaning more towards liking the establishment or kind of protesting against it, and how will that affect our foreign policy?
That's a great question. I'm really glad you asked it, because, of course, it's hard for me not to feel that we're rerunning 1968 right now. It's really chilling. An assassination attempt on a candidate. The incumbent decides not to run. That's another 1968. The Democrats, for reasons best known to themselves, are holding their convention in Chicago, which in 1968 was an unmitigated disaster and probably will be this year too. And then you have the geopolitical setting, which is again the same, with the Russian aggression, Czechoslovakia then, Ukraine now. So it's hard as an historian not to feel a kind of uncanny sense and foreboding, because 1968 just kept getting worse, and we're in July. I think your formulation's not quite the way I'd put it. The way I put it is that there are these competing strains within the two parties, then and now. Within the Republican Party, there is, I'll use your term, an establishment that is Washington and New York. And then there is the populist tendency, which is Middle America. And that tension was there in the 60s too, and Barry Goldwater represented the populist wing. And Richard Nixon was neither one nor the other. Nelson Rockefeller was the establishment side, and that was Kissinger's main man through the 60s. And Nixon was somehow in between, and neither one thing nor the other, but was able to win in 68 because of the third party candidate, because of Wallace. And remember, that'll be another parallel when the election comes. It may well be that the votes that go to the other candidates decide the outcome, as happened in 68. And within the Democratic Party, it's the same. The great battles in foreign policy go on within the parties, not between them, because the establishment Republicans and the establishment Democrats mostly agree today, China very bad. Just as they mostly agreed by the late 60s, we've got to get out of Vietnam, and they mostly agreed in the early 60s, we've got to go into Vietnam. So the establishment and the two parties have groupthink. And then you've got the progressive left, who went nuts in 68 over Vietnam and are going nuts right now over Palestinians. And then you've got the populists on the right of the Republican Party. And that's very much the way to think about it. And in that sense, I don't think the fundamental structure of American politics has changed all that much in 50 years. It's just the names that have changed. Can I add one last point?
Please. Yeah.
If you look carefully at what Trump and Vance and other Republicans have been saying this year, the word realist keeps coming up. And they, I think, are quite deliberately positioning themselves, rather as Nixon did in the late 60s, as realists. The Democrats have these ideals, and they get into forever wars, and then we have to come and clear up. That's how they're positioning themselves, and I think it's quite shrewd, because it worked in 68, and I think it'll work in 2024.
Thanks, Neil. We've got time for one last question.
I'm not saying that's good.
Over here.
I'm just telling you what's going to happen.
You could subtitle the whole talk with that too, actually. That's pretty...
Right here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very enlightening discussion. What would Kissinger say about the importance of NATO, and would Russia stop if they invaded Ukraine? Would they go on to other countries?
Kissinger spent a great deal of his career wrestling with the same problem that we have today, that the West European members of NATO do not pay their way. That was a problem in the 1960s, would you believe? He even wrote a book about it, The Troubled Partnership. President after president, going all the way back to Nixon, has tried to get the Europeans to pay a larger share of NATO's expenses so that the US does not have to carry, 2/3 or so of the burden. And the only president to achieve anything in this regard has been Donald Trump. And the only way he's achieved it is by implying that if they don't pony up, he will actually leave. So I think, once again, the issues we grapple with today are remarkably familiar issues. the astonishing thing is how little progress we've really made in making NATO a better balanced alliance. The US still plays far too large a role in European security. And that was immediately obvious when the US stopped the aid to Ukraine. The Europeans could not compensate for the sudden lack of US military and financial aid. Kissinger's view, I think, remained you could not have Ukraine in NATO and expect stability. His, I think, view in 2014 and again 10 years later was ultimately there would have to be a neutral Ukraine with better security guarantees than had been offered in the 1990s. And I suspect that that is where we'll end up. I find it very hard to imagine that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. It may become a member of the European Union, but that does not solve the security problem.
Thank you guys very much.
That's it.
Neil and Evan.
Which way do we go? That way?
That was good. We're going to go up this way.
Thank you.